the Mueller investigation be today? Would there be a Mueller investigation today?
Well, and it is remarkable given, I mean, we now, with a couple of years' distance, we now know more about the interactions between President Obama and President-elect Trump at the time. And it wasn't like Obama was giving him a piece of his mind and telling him, how he should govern and what he should do in terms of policy and everything. He seems to have basically come to him with two things, like the North Korea thing is way more serious than you might think it is, A, and B, the only other thing I'm giving you advice about is don't hire Mike Flynn. We can debate how he dealt with A, but B is absolutely turned out to be something that may end up being the dominant story of his presidency when its obituary is finally written.
Yeah, and possibly the single worst decision he made as president-elect, choosing Michael Flynn as his national security advisor.
We will find out.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Well, today in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., at the state funeral of George H.W. Bush, 5 presidents sat in the front row. And from the altar, one of them was told that he is corroding, rotting away inside.
He never hated anyone. He knew what his mother and my mother always knew. Hatred corrodes the container it's carried in. The most decent and honorable person I ever met was my friend George Bush, one of nature's noblemen.
Hatred corrodes the container it's carried in. And there, sitting in front of former Republican Senator Alan Simpson in the front row, is a man who is nothing but hatred, filled with hatred. In Alan Simpson's view, a corroding container of a man. When Donald Trump's time comes and he is being remembered by people gathered in a cathedral, no one, not one person, will step up to the microphone and say he never hated anyone. No one will step up and say he was the most decent and honorable person I ever met. No one will say he was one of nature's noblemen. No one will say that. I know Alan Simpson. I worked with him when I was on the Democratic staff in the United States Senate, and he was one of the most reasonable Republicans with whom we mostly disagreed on policy, but worked with every day. Alan Simpson knew that by saying George Bush never hated anyone, and by saying hatred corrodes the container it's carried in, his words would be interpreted as a direct reference to Donald Trump. Alan Simpson knew that his words would be taken as praise for George Bush and at the same time as condemnation for the president who has publicly spewed more hatred than any president in history. Donald Trump had to take his seat in the front pew of the National Cathedral today, the day after Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller revealed some of the reasons why he is recommending no prison time for Donald Trump's first national security advisor, Michael Flynn, who has pleaded guilty to 1 count of lying to the FBI. The Trumps had to sit beside the Obamas in that front row today. The only time that Donald Trump and Barack Obama sat as close together in a private conversation was when President Obama invited President-elect Trump into the Oval Office, and when the door was closed, President Obama warned Donald Trump not to hire Michael Flynn as his national security advisor. Donald Trump had to sit in that front row today with the other presidents, with Donald Trump drowning in the countless humiliations he has brought upon himself as president, including recurring proofs that he is the most ignorant president in history. Donald Trump had to sit there in the front row of the National Cathedral, covered in the humiliation he has earned thanks to Stormy Daniels' description of his pursuit of her, and the federal criminal case in which Donald Trump is named as an unindicted co-conspirator for arranging illegal payments to Stormy Daniels. It's hard to know which of Donald Trump's many humiliations weighs on him the most. But today, sitting in that front row with President Obama, on a day when Michael Flynn is once again dominating the headlines, it must have been extra painful for Donald Trump that Barack Obama was sitting in the "I told you so" position on Michael Flynn. Where would the Trump presidency be today if Donald Trump was smart enough to have followed Barack Obama's advice and not hire Michael Flynn as his national security advisor? Leading off our discussion tonight, Joyce Vance, former federal prosecutor, Jill Wine-Banks, former assistant Watergate special prosecutor, and Jason Johnson, the politics editor at TheRoot.com. All three are MSNBC contributors. And I want to begin with this political point, Jason, so I'm going to go to you. And that is Alan Simpson's words today were surely chosen carefully, knowing that there was a double entendre there. There was the direct praise for President Bush that he wanted to deliver, but the unmistakable condemnation of Donald Trump. To say things with Donald Trump sitting right in front of him about George Bush never hated anyone, and to talk about what hatred does to a person, how it corrodes a person, was something that I know Alan Simpson deliberately intended to apply to Donald Trump. And I'm sure that Americans watching that today had to think about that comparison about Donald Trump's relationship to hatred and hating people versus President Bush's.
Yeah, at this point, between Aretha Franklin and John McCain and President Bush, I don't think we're going to have a large funeral in America that does not include criticism of President Trump at some point or another. But I hope, to the degree that he goes to these events as a pouting, surly 7-year-old, which is usually how he seems to behave when he's in the room, that he takes some of the advice that's being given in the intention of which is given, which is like, look, we all want you to actually do a better job. But Lawrence, I think that the sort of key thing also is this. If there's one thing that we understand about this president, it's his desperate need for attention and praise and some attempt of creating a legacy where he'll be looked at as a great man. And perhaps in sitting down and listening to how people talked about George Bush, for all the many criticisms that I have of him and his policy, maybe Donald Trump might pick up a little something about how he should behave as a president so that one day when he passes away, there may possibly be a room of former state officials who can speak some kind words about him. Although right now, I don't think it's going to happen.
Jill Wine-Banks, I want to rewind history for a moment here and go back to that Oval Office discussion that President Obama had with President-elect Trump. And imagine if Donald Trump took the advice seriously and followed that advice and did not hire Michael Flynn. It is possible that we would not have a Mueller investigation tonight because James Comey was fired only after Donald Trump asked him to go easy on Michael Flynn. If there was no Michael Flynn case to go easy on, where would we be now?
I think that's an interesting speculation, and it is, of course, possible because anything is possible. But given the type of people that Donald Trump has hired and surrounded himself with throughout the campaign, the transition, and in the administration, it's quite likely that someone else would have been the cause. If it wasn't Donald Trump asking Comey not to go after Flynn, maybe it would have been, don't go after Papadopoulos, don't go after Gates, don't go after who knows who it would have been. There were so many that were under investigation, rightly so, because of the criminal acts that they have committed. You could not have had the number of indictments and the number of defendants, the number of guilty pleas, the number of convictions, if it wasn't for the fact that so many people are guilty. So I think it would have happened anyway. It just would have been delayed. And it would have been wonderful. He had two opportunities to act. Of course, first was President Obama, but then remember, the acting Attorney General, Sally Yates, came and warned him right away, and he didn't fire him. He waited 18 days and let him stay in office as his national security advisor, knowing that he was compromised by the Russian government, which only indicates to me that there's more to Donald Trump's being compromised by the Russian government, that he didn't care, and he kept him on anyway.
And Joyce Vance, Michael Flynn's problems began during the transition and these phone calls that he was having with the Russians during the transition. And so presumably at some point the FBI was going to get interested in those phone calls during the transition, so that even if Donald Trump in the end did not appoint him as national security advisor, there probably at some point would have been an investigative process that involved Michael Flynn and might just have us where we are tonight.
I think that's absolutely right. The idea that you can have as an American citizen phone calls with the Russian ambassador and not expect those phone calls to be subject to some kind of surveillance in Washington is a little bit iffy. We know that those are the sorts of calls that at least there's intelligence about the content of. So that forces us to consider the question of what did Flynn know or what did Flynn think that he knew that would protect him from likely discovery of what he was up to at some point. That, I think, is a very interesting unanswered question.
Let's listen to what the president said about why he fired Michael Flynn. And we're going back to February 2017. Because reconsidering these words tonight, given all that we know since then, makes this the president's answers to these questions all the more interesting. Let's watch this.
Did you direct Mike Flynn to discuss sanctions with the Russian ambassador prior to your inauguration?
No, I didn't.
And
Mike,
would you have fired him if the information hadn't leaked out?
No, I fired him because of what he said to Mike Pence. Very simple. Mike was doing his job. He was calling countries and his counterparts. So it certainly would have been okay with me if he did it. I would have directed him to do it if I thought he wasn't doing it. I didn't direct him, but I would have directed him because that's his job. No, I didn't direct him, but I would have directed him if he didn't do it, okay?
Jill, you want to try to make sense of what we just heard?
Well, making sense of much of what Donald Trump or his legal team, particularly Rudy Giuliani, says is very difficult, but it's his typical defense. I didn't do it, but if I did do it, it's perfectly legal. If he did it, it's legal, but he didn't do it, and it would have been okay if he did it. It's really nonsense. He shouldn't have been doing it. All of these things that he says are okay, he's convincing a certain portion of America that it is okay, and I just hope anyone listening to this show knows that it isn't okay. You can't have private citizens, and remember, during the transition, they were just private citizens. They were not representing the government of America. The Obama administration was still the government of America, and you don't transition until noon on the day of inauguration. And it's wrong to have any private citizen interfering with the conduct of foreign affairs. And anyone who is about to become president and or the national security advisor should know that and should not engage in that kind of conduct. So it makes no sense.
And Joyce Vance, the questions we just heard Kristen Welke ask are certainly questions that Robert Mueller wants to know the answers to. Did you direct Mike Flynn to discuss sanctions with the Russian ambassador? And in Robert Mueller's filing about Michael Flynn and why he should not get prison time, he said, among other things, the defendant's assistance to the government was substantial. The defendant has assisted with several ongoing investigations, so that's certainly more than one investigation and probably at least three or more than three. And one of the questions that they need to get from Michael Flynn is, did the president tell you to discuss sanctions with the Russians, especially since we now know through the Michael Cohen case that the president was interested in doing business in Moscow and creating a Trump Tower in Moscow and was presumably still interested in doing that while he was president of the United States?
That question would probably have been close to, if not at the top of Mueller's list of questions that he wanted to ask after Flynn started to cooperate. And we have to stop for a minute and think about what Flynn has been charged with. He's been charged with making false statements to the government. So Mueller's not taking any of his words at face value. And we see from the sentencing memoranda that Flynn was able to provide documents and also communications. And so at this point, it seems logical to assume that however Mueller has answered that question, He's not just relying on what Flynn tells him, he's relying on documentary evidence that Flynn can provide as well to back up the story he's told.
We've got to squeeze in a break here. Jason Johnson, Joyce Vance, Jill Wine-Banks, thank you for starting us off tonight.